Hello! Welcome to Chelsey's Book Nook. Today I am going to talk about Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert. So, this book I got at a used book sale, and I had no idea what it was about, but I recognized the title, and I knew it had been adapted into a movie, so I figured it was popular enough that it was worth reading. What I didn't know when I bought it was that it's not a fictional story. It's a memoir, the author's own personal experience, which is fine, but the majority of my readings are fiction, and when I read nonfiction, it's usually because it has been heavily recommended. So when I started reading it, I was definitely surprised, and but I still enjoyed it. So the author, Elizabeth Gilbert, went through a really rough divorce, and when all was said and done, she took a break and traveled the world for a year and got an advance from her publisher to write this book about her travels. So it's divided into 3 sections because she visited 3 countries in a year, 4 months in each country. First she went to Italy, where she focused on pleasure. That's the eat part of the title. Then she went to India, where she spent 4 months in a yoga ashram to focus on meditation and prayer, and that's the pray part of the title. Then she spent her final 4 months in Bali, Indonesia, figuring out how to balance both pleasure and prayer. That's the love part of the title. So, what made this book work is that Elizabeth is good at making friends, and so we're introduced to a lot of people in all 3 countries that she visits. If it had been just her by herself, I don't think the book would have been as readable. So the whole point of the whole thing is trying to, 1, find herself, and 2, find a relationship with God. Because when she was struggling in her marriage, she had a moment where she finally tried to pray out loud, and she felt God answer her, and she wanted that to be something that was normal in her life, instead of only in times of desperation. And so she doesn't talk about it too much. It's only mentioned a few times, but she has a notebook that she writes in her notebook her prayers to God. That's how she talks to God, is writing in this notebook, and then I guess she feels some answer and writes back to herself. At first when I was reading that, I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. And it almost felt a little blasphemous from my religious point of view, but then I eventually realized that that's not fair to judge her prayers that way, because I believe that God answers us in the way that we can hear and understand Him, and in a way that we'll listen. So obviously how God answers my prayers is going to be different how God answers her prayers. So she did learn how to communicate with God. She even got it down in Italy before she even went to India, and India was the focus of praying and God. And she has some really special spiritual experiences that, from a devout religious perspective, was incredible, and I enjoyed reading about them. But then I got a little disappointed because at the very end she decides that all of the feelings she was having was like her future self reaching out to her, and I just felt that was a little weird, and unless she just worded it in a way that I didn't understand, but yeah, I didn't really connect with that conclusion at the end of her book. So when she's in Italy, she takes classes to learn Italian. She'd already taken some classes in the States before she went there, so she could have a basic knowledge of the language. But so she took Italian classes and met some other foreign students there to practice Italian with, and then she also met some native Italians that she practiced speaking with, and they would practice speaking English with her. She made a lot of friends while she was in Italy. She did a lot of traveling, and she had family members come and visit her while she was in Italy, and it was definitely my favorite part of the book, was the Italy part. Then when she went to India, she spent the entire time kind of like, I guess, as a yoga student in a temple, and she had to live a pretty rigorous, scheduled life there. She talked about how she had to apply there. You just can't show up and decide to stay there. It's not like a hotel. So she had to apply and get accepted, and she had to wake up at 3 in the morning every day and do prayers and meditation, and she had a job. She had to help clean the temple, and it was definitely really interesting. And one thing she does with all of the people that she meets is she changed their names for the book, except for one person who she calls Richard from Texas, and she meets him while in India. He's one of the yoga students there, and he gave her permission to use his real name. And so she learned a lot about letting go of all of her pain and letting go of her past and moving forward and looking to the future while she was in India. And it was really interesting to learn about that aspect of yoga, since Americans like myself usually use yoga to increase our flexibility and use that as a bodily exercise instead of a brain exercise or mind, spirit, which is a true yoga. And then in Indonesia, she spent split up her time with a medicine man and a natural healer woman who had a shop in town. And her time in Indonesia was my least favorite part of the book, because I felt like all of the people she met there were just trying to get as much money out of her as possible. And I mean, you know, it's a tourist destination, and she was a tourist, so I don't fault them for that unnecessarily, but it just was kind of sad for her to be so unaware that that's what they were doing. But at the same time, it's kind of obvious, because like every time she talked to the medicine man, he would say, "Oh, there's not a lot of money in my bank account. Send more Western people to me." And she even bought a house for a woman who needed a house for her family, and that was a really, really good thing. But all the money that she asked her friends and family to send to help this woman get a house almost didn't go to a house, and that would have been really devastating for her to have to tell her friends and family that were all victims of fraud. But luckily she was able to she almost had to force the woman to buy the house. Otherwise, all that money just, who knows what it would have gone to. So she meets a man in Bali who she names Felipe, and he's from Brazil, and she said that a lot of, she called Westerners, Europeans, Americans, South Americans, etc., pretty much when their life falls apart, they run away to Indonesia and live out their life there. And so that's what had happened with this man, and they fell in love, and she spent the remaining of her time living with him in Bali, and she didn't know if their relationship would continue or end when it was time for her to leave. And she ends the book with them jumping off of a boat into the ocean. And so I wanted to know if her life continued with him, because she seemed to, I mean, she fought falling in love with him, but then she eventually did, but I couldn't tell if it was like, okay, I'll just take advantage of this while I'm on this trip, or if it was going to last. So it turns out that his real name is Jose Nunez, and she did marry him in 2007, but they got divorced in 2016 because she fell in love with a fellow writer and one of her good friends, Rhea Elias, and so she had a commitment ceremony with Rhea, but they didn't get married, and Rhea did die in January of this year from cancer, I believe. She was, yeah, and so I do want to take this time to offer my condolences to friends, family, loved ones of Rhea, and fans. Rhea was also a writer, so I'm sure she had fans who didn't personally know her but were affected by her death. I'm incredibly sorry to anyone who knew her. That I can't imagine what that feels like, and I hope everyone who's hurting from her death can feel God's love and comfort in their lives. I enjoyed reading this book one time through. I don't think I'll reread it, and I'm not going to keep my copy. I'm actually going to pass it on to a friend who I think will benefit from reading it. I think that she needs some of the inspiration in this book, and this book did inspire me to seek out little adventures of my own. I'm not even close to getting a divorce, and I have young kids. Like, I'm not going to take off for a year, but I do want to, at least with the stuff that is surrounding me locally, find time to do things on my own for myself. Like yesterday, I went into a session in my local LDS temple by myself. I've never done that before. I usually go with my husband or my mom or a friend because I felt scared to go alone, which is kind of silly, but you know, I think being alone is something that humans are scared of, but at the same time, it's something that we need to do every once in a while. So I went by myself, and it was really good. It was something that I needed, and I want to do more stuff like that, like whether it's go to the temple by myself, or maybe go to a restaurant by myself, or I want to maybe take some dance classes or a art class or something. I mean, my husband and I, we do date nights once a week, and my mom watches our kids for us, and that's really good, but I want to find something for me, and this book inspired that, and it's been something a long time coming, and that I've been thinking about, and reading this book, I was finding like, you have to do it, no more thinking, just do it. So I'm excited for that, and I give Eat, Pray, Love 3 out of 5 stars. That's not a bad thing. For me, 3 out of 5 is a neutral score. It doesn't mean the book was bad. It just means that it was worth reading once, but I'm not going to keep it. But I still recommend reading it. If you like this kind of stuff, it's worth reading once. So that's Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert. Next, I am currently reading Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. I just barely started, so it'll take a while for me to finish. In between, I might do talk about maybe Harry Potter fan theories, because that's like my favorite series. Or I've also thought about doing my favorite historical fiction author, Philippa Gregory. I've thought about going back to her books and maybe talking about historical accuracy versus oh, I'm blanking on the word. Versus creativity in her stories. So I guess just whatever comes first is what I will do next. So until next time, see ya!